that was just 6-mode melodic minor leading to super Locrian, eventually resolving to like a C triad with a flat 6 over the F minor major chord. Now, if your eyes glazed over at the phrase 6th mode of melodic minor, this lesson is for you. Today we're going to look at the 4 scales you actually need to know to get started as an improviser. So we've all probably been there asking a more experienced musician, well, what did you play on this set of changes? Or what was that cool idea that you played? And maybe they go off on a tangent explaining like every intricacy of music theory that maybe is floating around in their brain when they're playing these things. If you're just getting started as an improviser, this can seem overwhelming and seem like, well, where do I start? How am I ever going to get all this information together? Hopefully today's lesson will help get you started on this path of the music theory that is useful for us as improvisers and see how you can keep in the right perspective to inform your playing. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that today's content is sort of inspired by a question from one of the members of the virtual studio. If you want to get some more support practicing some of these concepts, get some additional concepts to work on, check us out at Patreon, follow the link below, you know what to do, and hopefully we'll see you over there. They were wondering, how do you get started on these very concepts? And it's something that occasionally people do ask, and even though I don't emphasize scales a ton in my own teaching or playing, they are important, I thought it would be good to make a lesson covering the foundations of this concept. Now, we are only going to talk about 4 today. Obviously, there are more than 4, but these are going to be a great place to get you started. And the ways we learn these today, and actually the specific scales we learn, will hopefully help build a good foundation so when you do learn some of the more complicated scales, more advanced scales, however you want to think about them, you'll have that strong foundation to lean on. Because in all honesty, many of those scales are sort of variations on the one we're going to learn today, or they will use the same concepts to construct them. So hopefully this will help get you going on the right path. Okay, I've got 2 caveats before we get started today. First thing is that we are not going to talk about major scales today. We're going to sort of assume that you have major scales together, or at the very least, you are working on getting major scales together. Incredibly important, all this information we're going to talk about today requires that you know major scales pretty well, and that you have a strong foundation there. They are the basis for a lot of the harmonic language that we use, and we just need to make sure we have good control over them. So make sure you're getting good practice on those. The second caveat is, remember, scales are tools. They are not going to teach you how to improvise. They are just going to help inform your ears and help you build your music theory knowledge so you'll know what options you have. Listening and transcription is really the only way to make this stuff work and make it sort of contextualize the information. You want to be able to draw from a given transcription. Say you're transcribing Clifford Brown, you hear Clifford play a great lick, you can transcribe it, analyze it, and see, oh, he's using this type of scale. Maybe I can use that type of scale in a way that's similar to Clifford, but just twist it a little bit. Suddenly then, you actually know what to do with this information rather than it just sort of existing in a vacuum. That doesn't help you as much as it could. So make sure you keep these in the right place in your sort of improvisational mind and keep them in perspective. Let's get into things with our first scale that we're going to learn for today. If you're a frequent viewer of this channel, you'll be not surprised to find out that it's the minor pentatonic scale. I love this scale. I think it's incredibly versatile, and it's something that all of us as improvisers need to know. If you're someone who's working on jazz improvisation, you probably already have some familiarity with this scale, but let's break it down a little bit. This is a pentatonic scale, so it's a 5-note scale. It sounds like this. I should add that all of our examples today are going to be in F. Now to build this scale, we're going to base it off the root, the flat third, the fourth, the fifth, and the flat 7 in the key of F. This is where making sure you know your major scales really, really well is super important, because you need to be able to draw on those scale degrees of thinking, okay, well, what is my third note in F? F, G, A, and then, okay, for this scale, I lower it down a half step, make it a flat third. That's going to give me an A flat. Incredibly important skill that you need to make sure that foundation is strong for. We've talked about this scale a lot on this channel, so I'm not going to linger here too long, but it works great in many different situations. It sounds great on the blues. It's very effective to help you build melodies on tunes that are just in F minor. It's also very useful if you want to sort of stretch the harmony and maybe shift from being in F minor to maybe in another key, still saying pentatonic with your ideas. This is an incredibly versatile tool, and if I was only going to teach you one scale to learn to become a better improviser, it would be the minor pentatonic scale. So start with this one, see where it takes you. Cool. On to scale number 2. We're going to talk about the Mixolydian mode. So when we're talking about the Mixolydian mode, I like to think that this is a major scale with a flat 7. Now there's a couple other ways you can get to this mode, but that is my preferred way of thinking about it. I always really like to think I'm starting on a major scale and then I'm altering certain notes from that major scale in order to build these other scales that are available. So it sounds like this. This is a scale that's most often connected to a dominant 7th chord. So this is something that we might use to build melodies on a dominant 7th chord. So we could think about what are the chord tones of dominant 7th. They're F, A, C, and E flat. They're right there in the scale, the root 3rd, 5th, flat 7. Now, one thing we want to do with this is think about how this is actually going to work in context. What if we make this scale all 8th notes? When we ascend, we can see all of our chord tones land on downbeats. That's what we want. That's going to make it feel like we're inside the changes. Let's descend and see what happens. When we descend, that's no longer the case. This is one of the problems with this type of scale, this mode. We have to figure out a way to right-side the scale so that way the chord tones always land on the downbeats. Most people do this by using what's called the bebop scale or the dominant bebop scale. To create this, we're simply going to add back in the major 7, or in this case, the E natural. So we're going to have both an E flat and an E natural in this scale. That little bit of extra chromaticism is going to make this all work out when we ascend or descend. Chord tones are always landing on downbeats then, and we're going to feel like we're inside of the changes. There are lots of ways that you can add chromaticism into these basic scales to achieve this same thing. This bebop scale is just one of them. It has some great uses, but it also has some limits. So just make sure you're being cautious and really focus on the concept of am I landing chord tones on downbeats, not necessarily just am I sticking religiously to this scale, because it won't work, for example, if you start your line on a chord tone, but on an offbeat. Everything's going to be off then. So you've got to make sure that you're really focusing on the concept here and not necessarily just like, I got to play this scale. Now I mentioned this is going to fit really well on dominant 7th chords. Let's hear it if I used it in a long 2-5 on the dominant 7th portion of that 2-5. So this is going to be a 2-5-1 to B flat because that is where F is going to be the dominant chord. So let's check it out and see where I have some of these half steps in this lick. I use that bebop scale, and then there's one other little half step I add in there just to make sure I land on a chord tone at the end correctly. Let's check it out. On to scale number 3, and that is going to be our Dorian mode. This is the scale that people associate with minor 7 chords. For the most part, it is exactly the same as the Mixolydian mode. The only thing that we're changing is we're now also having a flat 3rd. So to build the Dorian mode, we want a flat 3rd and a flat 7. Now, just like in our Mixolydian mode, we're going to have the same issue of making sure chord tones resolve in the right places. So we're going to do the same thing. We're going to add the major 7 back in there. So an E flat to an E natural to an F. Let's hear that in 8th notes. And again, paying attention for where those chord tones land. This F minor bebop scale or F Dorian bebop scale is one that you might find slightly different in some jazz theory books. Some books will put the half step between the A flat to the A natural to the B flat. However, for me, that doesn't resolve our chord tones in the same way. And that's really the concept we're trying to grasp here is where do chord tones resolve? There are many avenues we can get there, and this is just one of them. So that's the concept you want to key in on. Now the same thing here is a Mixolydian. We use this when we want to build 8th note lines on minor chords. So let's look at this in a 2-5. So now the 2-5 is going to be in a different key because again, we're keeping all examples in F today. So that is going to mean it's an E flat, a 2-5-1 to E flat, because then our F is going to be the minor 7 chord. So let's check out this example. And again, look for that bebop scale shape that happens in this lick where we have F to E natural to E flat, so on and so forth. Just like in the first lick, that one had a few other little bits of chromaticism as well. Like I said, it's a big topic to cover, not something we're going to dig in today, but just make sure you're looking for those as you are listening and transcribing. Those 3 scales, minor pentatonic, Mixolydian, bebop, Dorian, bebop, those will get you through the vast number of situations as an improviser. Most of the harmony that we play, if it's a tune that's diatonic in nature, is those chords. And so that really gets us a lot of the way towards having the scale information together that we need to effectively improvise. The last one we're going to talk about is somewhat of an additional scale that we might want to learn. It's going to give us access to a few of the altered chords that we might see when we see like an F7 flat 9, a D7 flat 9. This will give us some of that sound. And it's just so we know a little bit what to do, what we see then when we see those chords, and we know how to access the alterations that are in that chord. This scale is the half-whole diminished scale. Sometimes people call this the diminished dominant scale. It is built up of a slightly more complex amount of alterations. It has a root, a flat 9, a sharp 9, a major third, a sharp 11, a fifth, a 6 or 13, and a flat 7. So that's a bunch of alterations in it, much more complicated as far as that side of things than the first couple of scales. Let's hear what it sounds like. The other way you can think about it is by just thinking it's consistent half step, then whole step, then half step, then whole step, then half step, then whole step, so on and so forth. That way can get you started. I would really encourage you to think about alterations if you can. That's going to serve you better in the long run. The scale is a big area of practice. There are lots of different things you can do with it, from things that are relatively inside sounding to things that are way outside sounding. One thing that many people like to do is put it into different patterns. It's also very useful on 2-5-1s. We would use it on the dominant chord. It's sort of a way to access more interesting, more colorful sounds on the dominant chord. We might take a little bit of one of those patterns and use that on the dominant side of the 2-5-1. Gives us a little bit of interest, maybe a little bit of crunch, resolves, that kind of feels good for us and for the listener. The scale is a little more complicated than the first three, so take some time, practice it slow. Maybe choose like one pattern to get together or two patterns. There are a million of these patterns that people practice. Some of them lay okay on the trombone, in all honesty, some of them don't. That last one that I played, not the 2-5-1, but the last pattern, for me is pretty challenging on the trombone, and I cannot play it at faster tempos. I can only use it at some tempos where I can actually like execute it pretty cleanly. So choose ones that you think are going to fit well for you on the horn. A saxophone might be able to play it pretty well, pretty quickly, but for us as brass players, as trombone players, it might be more difficult. That's not a reason to not work on it, but just sort of choose wisely when you're working on this material. All right, that does it for our 4 scales that we want to learn to get started as improvisers. Remember, these scales are tools that we use to build melodies. Just playing a scale by itself and running up 8th notes up and down is not going to make you sound like a convincing player. It's all about what you do with these. They are the foundation, but they are not going to get you there on your own. It's all about listening, transcribing, and then trying to do something creative with this information. All right, we'll see you in the woodshed.